Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in opposition to this bill, and I would yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized for such time as he may consume.
Mr. Speaker, I listened to my colleague, the chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee, where he said that the likelihood is that we are going to have more and more pipelines constructed, pipelines that have to go through the FERC process, and that is certainly true. But all the more reason why we shouldn't be voting or supporting this bill. I have to say I am talking not just in general, in the abstract, but from personal experience in my district a few years ago when I was a congressman in Edison, New Jersey. We had a natural gas pipeline explosion. And fortunately, no one was killed or seriously injured, but a whole apartment complex was wiped out, not just one building, but a series of them. And there was a real danger of loss of life. And it scares me, Mr. Speaker, in all honesty, to think that we would want to change the process whereby FERC has the opportunity to look at the safety of these pipelines when they're proposed for permitting and somehow short-circuit that process. Because of my own experience in my congressional district in Edison, New Jersey. Durham Woods was the name of the complex. Now, because so many of these pipelines, or more of them, are being built, a lot of them are also in densely populated areas. So it is a major concern that FERC has to look at when reviewing these pipelines and deciding whether to issue a permit. It's not that, they're in areas where there are no people. They're often in very densely populated areas, like is the case in my state of New Jersey. So, in addition, I would say that, this bill is unnecessary. We have the Nonpartisan Government Accounting Office that concluded that the FERC pipeline permitting process is predictable and consistent and gets pipelines built. In fact, over 90% are approved or at least decided within the 12-month cycle, the limitation that this bill is proposing. The pipeline companies actually testified before the GAO that the process for permitting through FERC, quote, is generally very good, and that the sector enjoys a favorable legal and regulatory framework for the approval of new infrastructure. So if the process is fine, why are we now trying to move ahead and endanger safety by coming up with limitations on the process that actually is very good? I would also say that if you have a 12-month limit, which is what this bill proposed on FERC's ability to issue a permit, it's very possible that the process of permitting could be slowed down. Because if FERC decides that they don't have enough time within 12 months to decide whether a pipeline should be built and it's safe, they may just decide to not grant the permit and deny it for fear that they haven't had enough time to deal with it over the 12 months. So I think it's not only unnecessary, but it may actually be counterproductive of what the sponsors are trying to accomplish. I'd also point out, again, we're wasting our time because the President has issued a statement of administration policy saying that if H.R. 161 were to reach his desk, that he would actually veto it. I'm not going to get into all the specifics of why, because I think there are a lot of the same reasons that I'm mentioning myself. Now, let me say what happens. When faced with this 12-month deadline, it's not only the FERC, but also other agencies that deal with the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act or the Endangered Species Act, other agencies that have the authority to review this and permit this under the bill would actually only have 3 months, 90 days. So if after the 12-month period ends for FERC, then there's a 90-day period for the other agencies to act, and if they don't act within the 90 days, then FERC is required under this legislation to issue a permit and say that those other regulatory concerns are met. So now you're going to have FERC not only limited in its 12-month review, but also then issuing permits under the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and these other environmental regulations, which it has nothing to do with. So essentially, you're saying the other agencies have no role anymore, because if they don't decide within 90 days, FERC has to actually approve those permits as well, which it has nothing, FERC doesn't normally deal with any of these other issues. Now, the other thing I think is very important here, a lot of us have been very concerned on both sides of the aisle about the eminent domain issue. If the permit is approved by FERC, then that means that the company that's building the pipeline has the right to use eminent domain for the land where the pipeline is going to go through. I have been to a lot of concern about, whether or not eminent domain should be used in those circumstances, particularly if the permit process has been short-circuited. So, I think that sometimes my colleagues on the other side of the aisle don't understand that these permits are very detailed documents. They include emission limits, technology operating requirements, conditions to protect the environment. FERC doesn't have the expertise or the resources to issue the permits for these other statutes like the Clean Air Act and the Endangered Species Act. So I'm just saying, I think that this legislation, from a practical point of view, is entirely unworkable. It just doesn't work. It doesn't work. The GAO has said that the process that we have now is fine. And for those of us who've had these accidents, where we've had the explosions and the danger, the last thing that we want is these pipelines going through densely populated areas that haven't had the proper review to protect the safety and the health of our residents. And for all these reasons, I would urge that my colleagues oppose this legislation, and I would reserve the balance of my time, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume. I really don't understand. I respect my colleague from Kentucky a great deal, but he seems to be arguing that we need the deadlines in this bill to hold federal agencies accountable and ensure that they don't just, somehow sit on the applications. But as I've already noted, since 2009, FERC has completed action on 91% of natural gas pipeline applications within 12 months. So a 12-month deadline isn't needed for more than 90% of the applicants. So, my colleagues have asked, well, what's the problem with holding the remaining of the 9%, I guess, to a 12-month deadline? Well, this problem is it becomes a one-size-fits-all approach that fails to consider a wide range of applications that FERC has to review. Some of the applications for new projects, again, a small number, span hundreds of miles, cross waterways and wetlands, pass through neighborhoods and habitats of threatened wildlife, and questions of eminent domain need to be considered. So in these cases, there can be unresolved safety, environmental, and legal issues at the local or state level. And again, as I said, the President has said that he would veto this bill, and in the statement of administration policy, they specifically say, and I quote, "The small percentage of decisions that have taken longer than 1 year involve complex proposals that merit additional review and consideration." So, Mr. Speaker, if there is a complex project or there's some unaddressed risk to safety of the environment, we need to allow FERC or other federal agencies the time to ensure that the pipeline is safe, so we don't have an accident like what occurred in Edison, New Jersey, in my district. The last thing anyone needs, including the pipeline owner, is a pipeline explosion or other dangerous pipeline malfunction. And these things have occurred. I witnessed it myself in my district. So I'm just saying, don't put a hard deadline in the most complex projects that raise the possibility that FERC will be forced to approve a pipeline that is not safe or to reject an application solely because the Commission lacks sufficient time for an adequate review. That will hinder rather than help us get more natural gas where it needs to go. Now, my colleague also mentioned the issue about the Northeast electricity supply or prices, and I just wanted to address that concern. New England is using more natural gas to generate electricity and more natural gas for heating homes than in the past. And on the coldest winter days when natural gas is needed for heating or electricity, there is more demand. But this bill doesn't do anything to solve that problem. The problem in New England isn't caused by pipeline applications that take too long to get approved by FERC. The problem is that the pipeline companies aren't even submitting the applications because they haven't figured out who's going to pay for these new pipelines. The pipeline companies haven't been satisfied there's a sufficient year-round demand to justify and finance the pipelines. So that's an issue that FERC is looking at and has been holding stakeholder conferences about. But this has nothing to do with Mr. Pompeo's bill. cutting corners on the permitting process isn't going to help additional pipeline capacity built for the Northeast. I don't think we ought to be blaming the government for every problem, which is what I hear my colleagues on the Republican side doing. The reality is that FERC and the government didn't create this problem. It's a problem of the economics, and the faster we understand that, the faster we can try to find a solution. But let's not act as if FERC's inability to act is the problem here. That is not the case. I reserve my time.
Does the gentleman from New Jersey have additional speakers?
I don't, Mr. Speaker, but I'd like to yield myself such time at this point.
Gentleman is recognized.
I just wanted to, I'm not going to read the whole thing, Mr. Speaker, but I just did want to make reference to some part of the statement of administration policy saying that the President would veto the bill. Because it says the administration recognizes the need for additional energy infrastructure and supports the timely consideration of project applications. The administration, however, strongly opposes the bill because it would allow the automatic approval of natural gas pipeline projects if the FERC or other federal agencies do not issue the required permits, license, or approval within rigid, unworkable timeframes. H.R. 161 would create conflicts with existing statutory and regulatory requirements and practices, preclude opportunities for engaging the public and potentially impacted communities, thereby causing confusion and the risk of increased litigation. The bill's requirements could force agencies to make decisions based on incomplete information or information that may not be available, including potential environmental and community impacts of the proposed pipeline within the stringent deadlines, and to deny applications that otherwise would have been approved, but for lack of sufficient review time. So for these reasons, the bill may actually delay projects or lead to more project denials, undermining the intent of the legislation. I stress to my colleagues on the other side again, we understand there's a need for more pipelines, and we understand that these pipelines have to be approved in a timely fashion. But there's no reason to believe that that's not happening now. And the danger here is that in a case where these do have to have a more intensive review because of safety or health or environmental concerns, that we may actually do the opposite. Either they're going to be denied because the agencies don't have enough time, or, God forbid, they get approved when they shouldn't be. So, I just don't quite understand what this is all about. It seems like the Republicans, have a bill that they think is going to accomplish their goal but won't, and has the danger of really risking the safety of residents. And I've already witnessed that in the case of a pipeline explosion in my district. I'd reserve the balance of my time. I don't have any additional speakers. I don't know if the gentleman wants to close at this point.
I have no other speakers either, and I'd be happy to close once the gentleman finishes.
All right. If I could yield myself such time to
The
close.
gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just think that what the Republicans are doing is blaming FERC and trying to come up to a solution with a solution for a problem that doesn't exist. But in the process of all that, they're going to, jeopardize the possibility of the fact that some of these pipelines might be approved without enough safety or environmental or health concerns. And it seems to me that it makes no sense at all to put FERC in the position of deciding issues with regard to statutes like the Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act, that they really have nothing to do with. We considered this bill the last Congress, Mr. Speaker, and FERC made it clear that it was not necessary or helpful, and the administration threatened to veto the bill. Nothing has changed. The administration has again threatened to veto this bill. It's very early in this new Congress. I remain committed to developing sound energy policy with my Republican colleagues. If they want to have some hearings on this bill and go through the regular order of the committee process, that's fine. There'll be more opportunity to review it. But I don't think this bill will help anyone, and I think it may hurt a lot of people, including those who want to build a pipeline. Instead of spending our time debating a bill that will never become law, I hope we can begin soon to have some serious discussion about sound and sustainable energy policy. In the meantime, I'd urge my colleagues to vote against this particular piece of legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
For what For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
I have a motion to recommit at the desk.
Is the gentleman opposed to the bill?
I am opposed.
The gentleman qualifies. The clerk will report the motion.
Mr. Pallone of New Jersey moves to recommit the bill H.R. 161 to the Committee on Energy and Commerce with instructions to report the same back to the House forthwith with the following amendment. At the end of the bill, add the following
Mr. Speaker,
new
I
section.
reserve a point of order on the motion to recommit.
Point of order is reserved. The clerk will continue.
Section 3, pipeline owner responsibility in the event of an explosion. The provisions of this act shall not take effect unless the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, in consultation with appropriate regulatory agencies, determines that in the implementation of this act, 1, taxpayers will not be held liable for any repair or environmental cleanup from a natural gas pipeline explosion, and 2, pipeline owners will bear full responsibility for damages in any community resulting from a natural gas pipeline explosion, including for loss of life.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his motion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned before during the general debate, I and my constituents witnessed and went through a few years ago, when I was in Congress, a natural gas pipeline explosion. It was devastating to the community. We had many people who lost their homes. It was actually several apartment buildings. And even to this day, the memory of that is very much ingrained in the residents of Durham Woods and the largest municipality that I represent in Edison, New Jersey. So basically what we're saying in this motion to recommit is that the provisions of this act will not take effect unless the FERC determines that taxpayers will not be held liable for any repair or environmental cleanup from a gas pipeline explosion, and the pipeline owners will bear full responsibility for the damages of the community resulting from a natural gas pipeline explosion, including the loss of life. It seems to me that that's the minimum that we should expect when there is such an explosion. And believe me, at the time when that explosion occurred in New Durham Woods in my district, there were many instances where we had to have environmental cleanups and where the community was exposed to tremendous damages. So it seems to me that under the circumstances that this motion to recommit makes perfect sense. And Mr. Speaker, let me point out, there have been many pipeline explosions. I mean, I'm not going to go through the entire list. In fact, the one in my district is one of the ones that's mentioned here. But beginning just in the last 10 or 15 years, there have been numerous explosions. So we're not talking about something that doesn't happen. At this time, I'd like to yield the balance of my time to the gentleman from California, Mr. Aguilar. Mr. Speaker, once again, I listened to my colleague from California talk about the dangers from pipelines. These dangers are real. We've had many explosions over the years, including in my own district. And so I think that this bill really puts at risk the possibility of another pipeline explosion. It doesn't provide for enough safety or environmental review. I urge that the members support the motion to recommit, because at a minimum, it would provide some liability and some way to effectuate a cleanup and pay for the damages that come from an explosion that might take place in the future.
The gentleman